Y'all may be seated. Good morning, saints. Good morning, sinners. Last week I preached a riveting sermon that focused on the interaction between the younger son and his father. How do I know it was riveting? Well, not a single person fell asleep that I could see out there, so I'll take that as good news for me. I lifted up how families are dysfunctional because they're filled with dysfunctional people. And this family in Jesus' story is no exception. The runaway son shames his father and family by asking for his part of the inheritance prematurely. The father gives in to the request and then gladly receives the son when the son sheepishly returns home for help. I stepped out on a limb to venture to think that maybe God might be dysfunctional as well. God might be dysfunctional because of the way God so freely gives out mercy to those of us who have messed up greatly and return home for help. And I only had one person after worship disagree with me and tell me that God could not possibly be dysfunctional. Look, if I were to write a book and make that same claim, there would be a footnote at the very bottom of the page that said, of course, I don't believe that God is dysfunctional. But let's run with the idea for just a bit. The mercy of the father in the story creates space for this runaway son to return. And he meets him in mercy on the driveway of their home. God meets us in mercy too. For years, we preachers have primarily emphasized this reunion between the prodigal younger son and the merciful father. And we have dramatically used it to convince those who are lost in crazy, wild living that runs counter to God's ways to give up their sinful ways and to return home. And it's netted us some good results. But with all this focus on the prodigal younger son, we have failed to spend much time about what happens between the older brother and the father. Even the story tends to favor the reconciliation that happens between the father and the younger son. The story gives more real estate to that reunion, and the last part between the older son and the father is lost as a footnote to the main point. How many of y'all over here were a little jealous that they got to read so much more, right? That's what the story shows us, that this little interaction between the older brother and the father doesn't make much of the main point. I want to make a claim today, however, that this well-known story isn't 100% aimed at getting the lost to return home. It's about getting those who are already home to see how lost they are so that they can make room for others. Most people can't see how the older brother is lost. Most will see that the older brother is filled with the right level of righteous indignation. The older brother is the harder worker who is doing his share, and now his brother's share on work on the family estate. Most will appreciate how the older brother keeps his nose clean and works hard to keep things running. Most will identify with his work ethic and commiserate with him when his hard daily work is overlooked because of the neediness of the ones who have squandered away all their opportunities. Most would have problems with a parent who so easily receive the ones who have caused the most harm to the family. And it has been this way for hundreds of years. When we tell this story, we call it the parable of the prodigal son, singular. And all that attention goes to the younger one. But what if Jesus meant to tell this story precisely to point out to us, the ones who think we're doing everything right, that we might be the ones who are really lost? Over the last 2 decades, the quickest growing group in the religious landscape of America is labeled as the nuns. These are not Catholic women dedicated to a life of chastity and service. These are people who claim no faith identification at all. When asked what they consider themselves to be, they'll most often say that they are spiritual but not religious. And we have falsely assumed that this group is entirely made up of millennials who seem to function as a scapegoat with everything that is wrong these days. But that's not the case. Gen Xers and empty nesters are found in this group too. They peel out of church when their children move away from home, and they find that they have no compelling reason to be a part of the church anymore. A lot of ink has been spilled and articles written about why we think this is occurring. Some point to the growing secularism we see in our society and how any talk of faith that once was mainstream is not allowed anymore. You'll usually hear this when people say that we don't allow prayer in schools to happen any longer. Look, as long as there are tests being given out, there will be prayer in schools, right? What has changed is that a teacher or administrator is not leading it, which I'm okay with. I want to ensure that people leading my children in prayer are somewhere near my theological ballpark, and not everyone is in this area. But this represents a great opportunity for families of faith to form our children to be responsive to the needs of others and to offer prayer on their own, to become spiritual leaders to their peers. So some will point to that growing sense of secularism around us as one cause for the growth of this group of nuns. Some will point out that the always-on nature of our culture is leading to the growth of this group as well. Our schedules, are created in such a way that being a part of a church is not a main priority. I remember, we'll see if we can make it through with all the allergies today. I remember that Wednesday nights, for me growing up in Wichita Falls, were still clear on our schedule, so they wouldn't interfere with Wednesday night church activities. And I know some of y'all remember the older blue laws that were here in the South, where all businesses were closed on a Sunday so that you could be free to go to worship and be a part of the church. It wasn't just Chick-fil-A that was closed on Sundays way back when. But now, with something available to fill our time and extracurriculars, snatching up every free block of our weeks, we're training ourselves and our children to see how being a part of God's people, the church, doesn't have to take priority in how we use our time during this week. So we point to our always-on-demand culture for why the growth of this group is happening. We point to growing secularism as a case for why this group might be going. But when you ask this actual group why they're not really a part of a church or any kind of faith community, what they will say, the most common theme that they will give you, is that they're tired of belonging to a group of people who are too busy drawing lines to keep people out, that they shut themselves off to the party that God is throwing around them. In this spiritual but religious group, they'll talk about how they practice meditation, how they show up in nature to soak up God's goodness in creation, and how they'll regularly gather in groups to do life together. These are all things that the church advocates for and offers, but they have found alternative ways to practice them. They build these spiritual practices on their own, and they're happy with what they've created. And the best part for them is that they don't have to associate with a group of people they believe are too busy working in the fields of religion and who pass judgment on them for not doing it the right way. When Jesus tells this parable, Luke tells us that there are two groups of people around him. There are the tax collectors and the sinners, and then there are the Pharisees and the religious leaders. The Pharisees and the religious leaders grumble that Jesus, a very good Jewish rabbi, is eating with a wrong group of people. They pass judgment on Jesus and this group, and they show no mercy. And Jesus tells them the story, I think, not necessarily to prove the point that God will always accept the wayward sinner because of God's great mercy. No, Jesus tells this story to warn us who believe that we're doing everything right in the field of religion, that if we have no mercy, then we are the ones who are really lost. It's so easy for us to believe that we have to believe and do the right things in order for us to be in God's good graces. It's natural for us to begin to create lines of separation that say that we're in the embrace of God if you do X, Y, Z, while others must be on the outside. We all want to know who's going to heaven and hell, and so we create those strict standards. But in the spirit of Jeff Foxworthy's "You Might Be a Redneck," let me offer a few ways to tell you if the older brother is found inside of you. If your practice of your faith is making it miserable for people to be around you, you might be the older brother. If your faith is making it hard for you to extend mercy to yourself and to others, you might be the older brother. If you would rather keep working in the field than join in the party, you might be the older brother. Just as there was good news for the prodigal younger son, so there is good news for the prodigal older brother. God meets you in mercy too. God meets you in mercy when you're sulking and pouting and upset at how things ended. God meets you when you're full of judgment and points you to the party of mercy where there is a seat for you. God meets you in mercy that creates space for you to see beyond doing things right so you can start doing the right things. I believe that we must be a people of a well-informed faith that includes building doctrines that guide us and direct us, and adopting religious practices that give order to our lives. But if our religious doctrine leads us away from extending mercy to ourselves and others in great need, then we must look closely at whether we're inside the party of mercy or outside of it. A couple of years ago, a group of PMLC members plus some staff met to pray and consider our future as a church and the culture we find ourselves in. We know that things are changing pretty rapidly all around us, and we wanted to become clear about who God was calling us to be for our neighborhoods and for our region. We settled on a mission statement that guides us in what we do. Every church exists to glorify God and make disciples, but each church is uniquely built to play a part in God's mission in the world. Our unique call as Preston Meadow is to connect people, to share in Christ's mission of grace for God's world. Christ leads us in the way of grace, and we're called to connect people through worship, growing in groups, serving in ministry and mission, and connecting with others. We crafted values that reveal the special spirit of Preston Meadow. And beyond the values of joyful generosity and inspiring worship that many of us know, we discerned that God was and is calling us to be a people of compassionate acceptance in this current culture. This means that we welcome others as Christ has welcomed us. And as I said last week, if you have been joined to the family of God through baptism, you belong to the ways of this family. God, as our heavenly parent, directs us to extend mercy to those who are tired of belonging to groups primarily built to exclude others and tired of hearing how their lives don't measure up. So to celebrate our value of compassionate acceptance, we practice an open table at communion. It is available to all who are seeking God's grace, the grace that Jesus extends to us. This is not an exclusive members-only meal. It's not just for those who think they know who God is and what God is doing up here. It's not something we do because we're told to do it by religious leaders. It is the church's favorite meal because it reminds us of the great party of mercy that Jesus came to throw. And Jesus will not be happy until all of God's children find their way to the table. The parable of the prodigal teaches us that while we may turn our backs on God either in reckless living or harsh judgment, Jesus will never turn his back on us. In fact, Jesus will set a place for you at the table and wait and watch so he can come running to receive you in the welcoming arms of compassionate acceptance. My prayer for you is to receive first the mercy that God extends to you, and then for you to extend that mercy beyond you to those who are lost, whether they're in the same household or in a faraway land. Amen. And then, Steve, you were telling me you have something really important to share with the congregation.
I do.
Will we come up here and do that?
Blood drive, so Pastor Paul, he comes to me. We need 50 donors to let it bleed. You must be 17 years old with photo ID to proceed. in the narthex to let it bleed. Let it bleed. Meet the need. Let it bleed. Yeah, let it bleed. Come on, all healthy Lutherans, let it bleed.
Nice job.
Thanks. Next week's a big Sunday. We've got music at the second service. Come early. We've got donuts. You can have a couple donuts and then come in for the service. Sign up in the narthex. We'll be in the fellowship hall from 7:15 until we're all done. Thank you.